Welcome to Scotland's International Development Alliance's Spring Conference. A warm welcome to those of you here in Glasgow and to those joining online from further afield. I'm Tasnim Nazir, your chair for the event, and I'm delighted to be here to talk about the pressing issues facing the global sustainable development sector and look forward to hearing your ideas about how we innovate in a time of financial challenges and what support we'd like to see from political leaders. As a journalist who's used to live in Scotland for over 10 years, I've covered international stories within the global development sector, from empowering women and girls in schools to covering extreme poverty and raising awareness about key areas for development. We will shortly be starting with a keynote speech from the Minister of State for Development and Africa. This will be followed by our first panel session, and we'll then have a break from 11:30 till 12, and we'll return for the second panel to hear from the Scottish Government. At 1:30, we'll close for lunch, and I encourage you to stay and network. As the agenda is packed, we'll be sticking to time, so we'll rely on you all to help us. We'll be taking questions after the Minister's speech and after each panel, so do feel free to be ready with your questions. You can post your questions using Slido, and for those in the room, you can scan the QR code on the back of your badges to access Slido and post your questions there. For those online, the link will be posted in the chat, and if you're in the room, you can raise your hand if you prefer. As we're live streaming this event, we'd be grateful if you can help keep the connection running smoothly by avoiding the Wi-Fi and instead switch to using 4G to access the internet. Please also feel free to keep the conversation going on social media with the hashtag Alliance Spring Conference. And before we move on to the Minister, it's my pleasure to introduce the Chief Executive of the Alliance to say a few opening words. So please welcome Francis Guy.
Thank you, Tasneem. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this morning in Glasgow and online for this spring event. It's quite hard to believe that it's been a whole year since our first hybrid event in Edinburgh. A lot has passed in that year. We've learned a lot about the global impact of a war in Europe, what it means for global hunger in terms of grain prices and lack of fertilizer. We've also learned more recently how conflict has exacerbated the outcomes of a natural disaster in the earthquake in Syria and Turkey. And this week, we are reminded of the catastrophes of climate change as Storm Freddy tears through Malawi and Mozambique. And linked to both those things in Malawi and Syria is the ongoing issues of vaccine inequity. Because in both Syria and Malawi today, they do not have enough vaccines for cholera, despite growing epidemics in both areas. We will have time to discuss some of these pending issues, and I hope that you will have a lot of opportunity to engage with the panelists and engage with each other throughout the morning. But spring is also a time of opportunity, and we are halfway towards at least the 2030 target for implementing the Sustainable Development Goals. This week, Scotland launched its consultation on the National Performance Framework, which is Scotland's kind of answer, or at least part of an answer, of how we're implementing the Sustainable Development Goals in Scotland. The Alliance will be putting together a response to that consultation, and I really hope all of you can help us with that. The Alliance will also be carrying on working on our key themes of climate justice, well-being and sustainable development, shifting the power, and global citizenship. And I'd like to ask you to visit our stand downstairs in the breaks and tell us what you think we should be doing in those spaces. I'd like to also take the opportunity to thank others who have put stands up downstairs and to encourage you to visit them too. We have a stand from the Humanitarian Emergency Fund, which is Scotland's unique answer to dealing with forgotten emergencies, or at least part of the solution. We have WaterAid, we have the Sustainable Development Centre from Strathclyde University, and we have Diversity Travel. I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank StoneX, who have been loyal sponsors and who make the possibility of us doing hybrid events real. These things aren't entirely cheap. Thank you. I'd also like to thank you all again, as I said, online and in the room, and just to remind you that conferences are the beginning of a conversation. So I hope that you carry on any conversations and ideas that you've had in this room and online with us, engaging with us. Carry that conversation on with each other, but also with us on the hub. We need ideas to generate future action. Thank you very much.
The panel discussion was devised to address one of the most pressing challenges facing the global sustainable development sector, which is money. So our next panel is going to be about building an economy for global solidarity. We are faced with decreasing resources, yet an increase in need. So how should we respond? I'm delighted to introduce our panellists, who I hope will come armed with ideas for innovative funding practices, economic insight, and creating truly equitable partnerships. So I'd like to call on Lewis Temple, Chief Executive BRAC UK, Katie Gallagher-Swan, Economics Affairs Officer for United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, and we also will be having Adam Bertud, Executive Director of Global Programs to Save the Children, join us virtually. So again, I'm going to be taking questions from yourselves in person and also online on Slido. Again, you can scan the QR code, or you can have, put up your hand if you do have a question for any of our panelists today. We're going to be speaking. Firstly, I'd like to have a quick introduction from each of our panelists to tell them more about the work that they do, starting with Lewis Temple.
Thank you very much, Tasmi, and it's wonderful to be here today in Glasgow. I come from an organisation called BRAC. Organisation was founded in Bangladesh, and actually we have quite a long connection and history with Glasgow. Our founder, Fazle Hassan Abed, attended Glasgow University, and we even have some of our colleagues who are living in Glasgow today. So I very much enjoyed joining them last night to talk about development at a wonderful Bengali Indian restaurant called Rickshaw & Co., which I'd really encourage you to go to. Sorry, a little bit of promotion there. So BRAC was founded in Bangladesh in 1972. Very much when the country was born after independence, after a very difficult period of conflict. And the organization was founded fundamentally on the belief to do two things: to put women at the center of development, and secondly, to impact at scale. Not just to work in one or two villages, but to have a national impact. Now 50 years, or slightly more than 50 years later, I think that anyone who's familiar with BRAC can see that it has had a national impact. I run the UK arm of BRAC. We have a small office in London, and our role is to deliver things in the UK and in Europe which can't be done elsewhere. So we focus on resource mobilization and fundraising, advocacy, and communications, and increasingly trying to take the experience and voice of BRAC and the participants in BRAC's programs to decision-making in places like the UK, Europe and the UN. So an increasing focus of BRAC. So delighted to be here today. Thanks so much to the Alliance for welcoming me, and really pleased to be in lovely Glasgow. Thank you.
Fantastic. And could we hear a bit from Katie?
Sure. Is this working? Is it switched on? Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, okay, great. Hi everybody. Thank you very much for. Sounds like there's quite a lot of.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for having me today. I am Economic Affairs Officer at the UN Conference on Trade and Development. Since we've got a little bit of a history about BRAC, I'll tell you a wee bit about UNCTAD, just very briefly. So UNCTAD was founded in the 60s and 70s, coming out of the moment of the non-aligned movement and the new international economic order movement of G77 countries, that is countries that make up the global south, the majority of the world, recognizing that the way that the global economic order was run wasn't really in the interests of them. They were suffering uneven development, uneven ecological exchange and trade exchange, and they were looking to get out of the commodity trap. So we primarily focus on the interests in the global integration of developing countries and how they can profit in their development and being able to achieve the SDGs. So I'll stop there.
Fantastic, Katie. And Adam, can you hear me, Adam?
I can hear you loud and clear. And,
Fantastic.
Good morning, everyone. And lovely to be with you online. I only wish I could have been there in person, but it's great to be part of the panel this morning. My name is Adam Bertu. I'm Global Programs Director at Save the Children UK. I'm responsible for Save the Children UK's international programming strategy, working with colleagues from across our wider movement and partners around the world. I probably won't go into Save the Children's history. I hope most people in the room will know Save the Children. We're obviously a child rights charity, been around for over 100 years now. Maybe just a few thoughts to connect with the theme of the conference today, and I think maybe the Minister was saying this earlier, but, I would probably I've been working in the sector for over 20 years now and probably describe most of that time as being fairly linear and predictable. But, we're making progress towards the MDGs and then the Sustainable Development Goals, not as fast as we would like, not as uniform, but, progress nonetheless. The rules and norms within the system fairly well established and not questioned, at least from within. And, the UK was a development superpower. But the last few years, of course, have seen real disruption. We're seeing progress reverse across a number of different areas. We've seen, challenges to the international system, some regressive, the fracturing of multilateralism that we heard about, the attacks on humanitarian principles, some much more progressive, such as the decolonizing aid agenda. And obviously, sadly, the UK no longer that development superpower. So yeah, delighted to be here and, share some reflections on what this means and hopefully how we can harness some of this disruption for progressive change.
I'm going to be starting off to ask you each a question, actually. So what sort of impacts have funding cuts and also looming funding cuts had on existing and planned programs, starting with Lewis?
Maybe I'll try to I think that works all right. BRAC, as an interesting organisation, has actually had a very significant partnership with the UK government, an unusual one actually, and Andrew Mitchell mentioned the interest in supporting local organisation, and I think this was illustrated when he was previously the Secretary of State, that he signed a 10-year partnership with BRAC, called a strategic partnership arrangement with BRAC in Bangladesh as a local organisation, which had tremendous impact over that 10 years, including enabling more than 1 million people and their families to lift themselves out of extreme poverty. as well as and achieving 17% of the UK's impact on food security. So a very significant, and in fact it was close to £500 million over 10 years. So very significant funding as well for a local organisation. Sadly, that was not renewed in 2021 because of the budget cuts. The local FCDO, as they were by then, team in Bangladesh very much wanted to continue it, and that's had a huge impact on BRAC, but also the people that we exist to serve in the country. So yeah, absolutely terrible. Fortunately, I might mention later, BRAC has a business model which does enable it to have lots of other resources, but I'll talk about that a bit later. So I think that that very much undermined that sort of core philosophy of investing in local organisations, and had a big impact on BRAC. So yeah, I mean, that was something that was quite difficult, but we've emerged stronger from it, I would say.
And Katie, what are your thoughts about the impacts of having funding cuts and potential future cuts?
Well, I think it goes without saying that when there are cuts, the people who are impacted the hardest are always the most marginalised, the people who are made vulnerable by existing inequalities and existing injustices and imbalances. So we're thinking about women, we're thinking about children, we're thinking about refugees, we're thinking about people who are disabled, we're thinking about all the people who are marginalised in society. They're the people who are going to suffer the most. When we see these cuts, what that translates into is lost education outcomes, lost health outcomes, lost climate action, so it's really devastating, the short term. And when you work at the nexus of climate and economics, as I do, you know that the short-term investment is so much higher than the long-term, loss of not investing early on. So we should be seeing these things as early investments, but what that translates into on the ground is loss in all of these potential outcomes. But I also want to point to, we have the individual, example. They're devastating too. In 2021, ODA from OECD countries was 0.33% of GNI, when we know the target is 0.7. That was a shortfall of more than $370 billion lost in what should have been development finance. When we look at climate finance, we know that this 100 billion goal has never been met. I think the most recent number was 83 billion. But on top of those sort of bilateral relationships where money is not coming, we also have a reality of a global economic instability, which is draining public budgets in the global south even further. Whether it's the pandemic, which caused capital outflows in the order of hundreds of billions of dollars in the first few months of the pandemic, whether that is the political shock of the war in Ukraine, which caused commodity speculators in Geneva to push prices up of key commodities, meaning that they were far too expensive for developing countries to be able to purchase them, pushing supply out of the window, which meant that the imports that they normally depended on to have income were no longer viable. And then most recently, the monetary tightening in central banks of developed countries, but have meant that...
I mean, how does funding cuts save the children?
Well, I think like both the other panel members have said, it's been disastrous, really. And it's not just the cut from 0.7 to 0.5%. You've got to layer on top of that decisions to use the ODA budget to fund the costs of hosting refugees here in the UK, and that's another third of the remaining aid budget. Layer on top of that multi-year commitments that the UK government has to various multilateral institutions, and countries like Somalia and Yemen, at a time when humanitarian needs have never been higher, facing cuts of up to sort of 75% over the last few years. And I think, as Katie said, that's girls not going to school as a result of these cuts. That's children going to bed hungry at night because of these cuts. I guess the other thing I would say is also the impact it's had on the reputation of the UK government as sort of a trusted partner, both by the governments who they've worked with in the past, but also their development partners, like Save the Children. It's, we're at the front end of having to message these cuts, and facing the dilemmas, ethical, moral, financial, reputational, of going out to communities, to local national partners and explaining that, sorry, services won't continue, or the project is coming to an end. And so, yeah, it's been incredibly challenging. Sort of no criticism of the fantastic FCDO officials that we work with at the various country levels. You know, I think they're just as appalled as we are at the impact of the cuts. And I guess all we can hope for is that both the government and the opposition have committed to return to 0.7%. So we need to ensure we hold them to that and get back there as soon as we can.
You put up your hand. We've got a question at the front there. I think I'll bring the mic over to you. Oh, we've got someone who's going to bring the mic.
Hi, ma'am. My name is Abhinav, and I'm researching on circular economy, especially in the economic growth of India. So when it comes to my question, it's like what I would like to ask is like, what are the policies that Indian government has to framework in order to raise the economic growth by implementing the circular economy? Because during the last budget, they have already been specified that there will be a transition to circular economic policies by here on. So according to your opinion, what will be the right policies that needs to be framed out for a better economic growth? Thank you.
Is that to Katie or to all the
Katie.
panel?
Katie. Yeah.
Sure, curveball, circular economy in India, I'll have a bash. Thank you very much for your question. This is a very live discussion in the realm of the World Trade Organization, actually, where trade ministers and delegates of trade issues are discussing how to integrate climate and environmental issues into the trade rules. Now, unfortunately, the legacy of the way that these rules play out is that often, for a variety of reasons, whether that's just because they have more resources, so they have bigger delegations and more research capacity, often these rules are designed with the interests of advanced economies before they are developed countries. So I think in the example of the circular economy, you know, it's important to remember that while it's very, very important that we reduce resource use, we reduce consumption in advanced economies, for many developing countries, they've already been working with a circular economy and they've never left it, because waste and not reusing waste isn't an option. Now, that's not to say that it's incredibly important to build up the national capacities to be able to manage waste and to be able to process it. But I think there's, in the multilateral sphere, it's very important that India and other developing countries raise their voice to talk about how we can talk about circular economy, such that it isn't just countries like the United Kingdom exporting all their waste to another country for them to process, or that it means flooding the economy of a developing country with goods that are no longer sellable here, but will therefore completely collapse any native industries in developing countries. So it's really important that India and other countries who are strong in the WTO raise their voice on that, on circular economy issues. But at the domestic level, there is the importance of building capacity, of repurposing, recycling, waste management, which I know is an ongoing challenge, particularly in the subcontinent context. So I think that at the domestic level, that's the priority. At the multilateral level, is thinking about those development issues.
Thank you. Yes, Lewis, please do.
Yeah, no, thanks so much for that question. And perhaps to address more particularly around the economic growth and to focus that on the very poorest in India. And there are some very good examples actually already in India of the use of the social protection program to impact in a comprehensive way on the very poorest or the extreme poor. So there's a program in Bihar, which is one of the poorest states that is working in quite a comprehensive way with people living in extreme poverty. It's already impacted more than 130,000 people living in that situation and having measurable results, and you've got some of the most celebrated global economists studying that using randomized controlled trials. So I'd really encourage you to look at that, to focus social protection, which is sometimes not used effectively to target on the very poorest. There's some models in India which are really worth studying there and really worth analysis. In terms of the extreme poor, there's still a big burden of extreme poverty in India, are benefiting from economic growth as well.
And I've got a question come in online, actually, anonymously. What could smaller organisations learn from Save the Children and BRAC in responding to the economic crisis? I'm going to hand this over to Adam to answer first, and then Lewis and Katie, if you have. So Adam, what do you think smaller organisations can learn from Save the Children in responding to the economic crisis?
So thank you for the question. I think a few different things. We talked already, I think, about some of the major challenges or disruptions that the sector's undergoing, but there's also, I think, significant opportunities. And I always believe that when there is there's challenges or disruption, it is an opportunity to to plot a new way forward. Some of the things that we've been thinking about at Save the Children quite recently, is around what role we should be playing as an international non-government organisation looking forward 10 years into the future. What are the big shifts that we need to make in order to be still relevant and adding value within the system in that future world? And so, some of the things that we've done, which may well be relevant for local national organisations too, are around thinking through the partners with whom we work. Historically, a lot of our work was in partnership with only the UK government and the European Union, whereas now that represents a much smaller proportion of the work we do and the partners we work with. We're also, and I think it's quite common for humanitarian organizations, you're focused on the tyranny of the now, the Ukraine crisis, the Turkey-Syria earthquake, and not necessarily investing enough time and energy in thinking to the future. So we've actually set aside a small team, we call it the innovation bubble, with a ring-fenced budget, who are given the space and freedom to be thinking about, well, what are the challenges that children are going to be facing in the future, and what are the potential new solutions that we can find from that. I think investing in digital and data also is something that we're focused on. How do we upskill our workforce to take advantage of the digital revolution that, if harnessed, can be a great leveler and create opportunities for all. So those are just a few examples of things that we've been thinking about at Save the Children, which may well be relevant to others.
In responding to the economic crisis?
Yeah, I mean, but particularly to touch on the question about for smaller organisations, BRAC started as a small organisation, of course, as everyone did, and some of the experience and learning from that was, start with the community, start by understanding and really working with them to get the models right, that they can then be scaled. BRAC's founder had a favourite saying that small might be beautiful, but big is necessary. So but you need to spend time working on getting your models to work really well at a small scale, and the role of research is absolutely critical in that. Otherwise, how do you know the impact? The second thing I'd say is to really take advantage of resources in the community, such as volunteers. There's tremendous interest in this kind of work, both here in Scotland and the UK, but also in the countries where we all work. And BRAC has a huge kind of army of volunteers. Like in Bangladesh, we're working with 50,000 community health workers who are volunteers. So there's tremendous resources already there that small organisations can take advantage of. Thanks.
Thank you, Lewis. So would you like to add anything?
Just very briefly, I think if you're a small organisation working on development issues,
you need to work together. You know, you might have a very tight remit, but if you are able to work in coalition and be in touch with the other organisations in your field, then be in touch with them, work together, strategize together, do advocacy efforts together, because that way you will be stronger and you will show that strength that the Minister was talking about, of building that public awareness, but also the awareness towards our elected representatives that these things matter.
Thank you, Katie. And I'd still like to open up the floor if there's any questions. Yes, we have the lady in the green jumper.
Thank you very much to everyone who has spoken today. It's been most informative. We've touched upon the presence of faith-based groups within the international development community and talked about the sort of cuts to ODA, which I'm seeing as a byproduct in my own organization, sort of how that's impacting our agenda and what we would like to accomplish. However, I'm wondering if there's a place in this conference to talk about the presence of private sector and philanthropy donors and how they can contribute to sort of making up some of those shortfalls. We've talked a lot about government, but I'm just wondering if private sector and philanthropy have a place to be discussed today.
Well, do you have any thoughts on that issue?
Sure. I mean, I think if there are philanthropic efforts that want to try and fill those gaps, I think that that is welcome, provided that those philanthropic efforts are ready to listen to the actual needs and interests and priorities. Because, you know, we've heard before, or we've seen before, I'm sure many in this room, of projects, initiatives, programs that have not achieved their intended outcomes because there was a little bit too many people trying to stir the pot. And I think that different experiences of different philanthropies and private sector support points to the need for local ownership, points to the need for a laser-like focus on poverty reduction and the intended outcomes, and trying to prevent as much as possible the specific interests of those philanthropies and private sector, their own interests, intervening in what should be development objectives.
Lewis and Adam.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps to comment on the potential that private sector can have impact itself. Whilst BRAC is a non-profit organisation, it also has a number of social enterprises which themselves deliver development impact. For example, a dairy company in Bangladesh that sources from smallholder dairy farmers, provides them much increased incomes, and reaches 50,000 farmers to enable them to sell their milk into a supply chain. So there's models of the private sector itself having development impact. It doesn't just have to be charity and donations and philanthropy and aid which drives impact, but also the private sector itself, particularly those private sector like social enterprises, which are absolutely focused on impacting on poverty. I mean, we have seen big, increases in commitments from some of the big philanthropic donors. We've seen the Gates Foundation sort of double its commitment, but I would also echo what Katie said, that it has to be absolutely focused on where the needs are and the priorities in these communities, not in sort of global influence and so on. Yeah.
Thank you, Lewis. And Adam, do you have any thoughts on the philanthropic efforts, especially obviously with Save the Children, as you have volunteers as well?
Yeah, I think I would agree that private sector can be a real force for good. If they're thinking through carefully in terms of their role, particularly with growing climate awareness. I think the fact of the matter is that there's a growing financing gap to meet the SDGs. ODA is flatlining, needs are growing, and so we do need to be thinking about different development financing solutions. One thing I would say, though, is it's really important that it's not used as an excuse for governments to deprioritize development and humanitarian issues. We have at Save the Children recently established something we call Save the Children Global Ventures, which is looking at how can you attract new forms of development and humanitarian financing to connect with communities, families who've previously been financially excluded. So, for example, through establishing commercial funds where private capital is connected with social enterprise, child-focused social enterprise. We've recently been working to establish something called the Children's Impact Endowment Fund, which, unlike commercial funds, is capital is sort of recycled, and hopefully the same money can have impact several times. Also looking at results-based financing opportunities, as well as insurance and loans. So all different mechanisms to try and attract new sorts of development financing to meet that gap. But as the other panelists have said, it's incredibly important that the focus has to be on reducing poverty and addressing inequality and maintaining a laser-like focus on that.
Questions coming in online now, actually. We've got one from Alexander Knapp, who asks, the World Bank and DEVEX studies find 59% of development projects fail to meet their objectives. How do we fund better programme management of complex projects? I'm opening up the floor to a panellist to... Would anyone like to have a go? Give your thoughts. I could, it's really, I think what they're asking is how could we really get, fund better programme management, because it's very complex projects in the development sector. And,
Perhaps a little reflection on that word complexity. That sometimes the projects are too complex. In our experience at BRAC, our approach is to keep it simple, because if you want impact at scale, if you want to scale up your impact and your intervention to a national level, it's got to be simple, and complexity is not scalable. So I would reduce the complexity of the project, keep it simple, and that's the way you can impact at scale and more likely to get success.
Maybe just to build on that, as well as, I guess, the simplicity of the project is, I think, historically, the sector has been very focused on outputs and activities and not focused enough on results and outcomes. So creating more flexibility in the system so that you can be agile during the project delivery to recycle learning, what's working, what's not working, and adapt, and not have to go through hundreds of loops and delays before you can change your activities within a project. I think the other thing I would talk to is ensuring that you have that pathway to scale. I think too many projects are conceived at quite a micro level and maybe delivering well, but probably at a cost that's not affordable to be scaled by government. And so being really clear in terms of how you would manage to scale this from one village or a community up to a district, province, or even national level.
Morgan, is there any more questions? Yes, a lady in the white top, if you'd like to stand up.
Thank you so much. This time I've passed the test because I failed the first one. Yeah, my first question is, I know COVID-19 has brought so many struggles to organizations. So I want to know what were some of the specific strategies or policies that each of you kept in place in order to keep you running? And what advice would you give to grassroots organizations so that in terms of crisis like this, they keep working? And my final question is, sustainability is always a problem. So what are the policies that you kept in place to ensure that the programs or projects you put in place targeting poverty and climate change, there will be sustainability after your existence? Because we have several issues that, several cases that organization comes in place to provide trainings or programs for communities, and after the organizations are no more to support them, these people go back to square one. So I want to understand the policies that you put in place to ensure sustainability. Thank you.
Who would like to? Lewis?
Well, I can begin because I come less from a programmatic background. I come more from the policy and research end of things when it comes to development. But when it came to the COVID-19 pandemic, working for the United Nations, there's less of an immediate impact on the finances, even though we see that over the long term, because we're not waiting for the cycles of donors or funders. We have that relationship with the member states. But we also see it, posts go empty and they don't get refilled. So there is a challenge at that level of just staffing and being able to maintain capacity. But what I think it did do was meant that all of us the whole team became much more adept at working remotely, working efficiently on our own, and being able to really implement hybrid working. And I'm sure it revolutionized a lot of your work too, because beforehand, where a Zoom call felt like a really strange thing to do, or having a telephone call with someone on the other side of the world, suddenly that's the norm. So there's a huge boost to inclusivity, I think, as a consequence of the pandemic, where we actually are, paying heed to some of that decolonising the sector and making sure that, voices from all parts of the world, and particularly people who are in the contexts of development, are represented and participating in these forums and in meetings and conversations. On your second point about sustainability, so my role in UNCTAD, I work in the Climate Development Strategies Unit, and I lead and oversee and coordinate how we integrate climate into our work, because we have a development mandate, so we have focused on the development issues, and to the question that you asked in the previous session, that often comes up and butts against our climate objectives, because countries legitimately need to earn export income, and often they want to do that through fossil-intensive means. So in my role, we are trying to mainstream and make climate sensitive all of the work that we do. In the same way that, previously I also worked in development and gender issues, and the same way that we talk about gender mainstreaming and making our work and our programs gender transformative, I think we need to begin to think about, and continue, because I know lots of people are doing that, to think about climate transformative, as much as that is a challenge in many of the contexts where, countries like Mozambique understandably are trying to exploit gas, as much as that is likely to become a stranded asset in a few years, as the Minister mentioned. Understandably, a lot of these contexts are difficult to be able to implement climate action because of the imperative to raise finance for public spending.
Yeah, thank you very much for those two great questions. In terms of strategies during COVID-19, at BRAC, we really focused on using the resources within the community that we could take advantage of to address the immediate challenge. And for us, this was the community health workers I mentioned earlier. And they really came into their own. They're in the villages already, there are resources there. We were able to support them as much as possible, even through remote training and so on, to be able to get out and provide behaviour change work to ensure the minimum transmission of COVID. So I think that was for us a really important lesson learned, is that capacity in the community was absolutely critical. And the question on sustainability, a couple of responses to that. For us at BRAC, I mentioned earlier already about the social enterprises that we run. For example, we have a large financial inclusion program across the world through the provision of small loans and savings products for our microfinance network. And this is self-sustaining. So for example, in Uganda, we have around 160 branch offices right the way across the country, and week in, week out, we're engaging with around 400,000 women and their families living in poverty. And regardless of whether we have any grant funding or ODA funding, it's self-sustaining. So there are ways that you can continue to engage regardless of project funding, which, you know, as you say, often only lasts 3 or 4 years, and then it's gone, that can enable you to continue to engage in the long term. And I'm not saying business and social enterprise is the only answer. ODA and government work is absolutely critical as well for addressing problems that can't be addressed through business, but there are ways that you can maintain a presence in the communities and sustain your presence through business type approaches as well.
Thank you, Lewis. And Adam, do you have any thoughts on this?
I think a few lessons learned from COVID were around business continuity plans, you know, in terms of our operations. No one anticipated the global pandemic and the breadth and depth of the impact it would have. So I think every organization should be thinking and planning for the unexpected. I think really making sure we looked after our staff was incredibly important, and we're not going to be able to add any value and support to the COVID response if our staff were not looked after and supported themselves, given they were affected all around the world. And maybe from a programmatic sense, you know, just really to focus on what your added value is within a particular situation. You know, Save the Children our strengths are around child protection and education. And while, you know, in terms of, you know, COVID disproportionately affected those who were not children, who were older, they were still grandparents and parents and so forth, and therefore what value we could play in terms of supporting children, education work through schools, etc. I think on the point on sustainability, I think it's for us it's very much about how do you support the systems which are in place. How do we work with government in the countries where we work to ensure that, or with community-based organizations, other partners, so that development-funded projects, unfortunately, are very short-term. They're 1 year, 2 years, 3, 4, 5 years maximum, where to make some of the changes you're looking to achieve, you need 10, 20 years support, and therefore working in partnership is incredibly important. Ensure you're focused on, as I mentioned before, how would you replicate and scale this? There's no point having small boutique projects if they can't be sustained after the donor funding ends. So just a few thoughts on sustainability too.
Thank you, Adam. Now, we've had a question come in specifically for Lewis, actually. So can you give an example of a successful partnership you've had in the past, and how did you ensure equitable practices were upheld throughout the project?
Really good question. Thanks a lot for that. Actually, I'm going to draw upon an interesting one. And I mentioned this earlier, which is the partnership with the UK government and Australia involved as well. It's called a strategic partnership arrangement with BRAC in Bangladesh. And it lasted 10 years. And that was unusual for a partnership with 2 bilateral donors in terms of the equality of the relationship. What we agreed together as 3 partners was overall goals for the program and what we were trying to achieve. And there was no, I know everybody who runs development projects are probably familiar with log frames and detailed sort of output-related kind of objectives and so on like that. This just focused on, what we're trying to achieve together, and we regularly reviewed those. I think it was quite unusual in the sector, that degree of trust and that degree of partnership and equal ownership over the goals, rather than the donor saying, well, here's some money, you report back to us, the results you've achieved on these points. It was much more high level objectives. It's quite unusual, and I would love to share experience of that with other organizations who could both, hopefully, we've got a sort of environment in the future with international development funding, which can also focus much more on results and outcomes, and give a lot of flexibility on how you actually achieve that. I think in that instrument it did. So that was very powerful. So that, an unusual one, but one I think the rest of the sector can learn from.
Yeah, fantastic. And we've got a question in for Katie from Eric Muhia, and that is, in your opinion, Katie, what is the best way to balance investment in development while also addressing the urgent need to tackle climate change?
Thank you for the question. I mean, I think that the best way is to do them together. I think for too long there has been a sensation that climate and development are at odds with one another, and that in order to develop, the only route is the dirty route, because that's what's been done before, right? That's what the developed countries do, and that's why we all have per capita emissions that are 50 times, 80 times the average person in sub-Saharan Africa. You know, so we have to bust that myth, but we can only do that if we have proof of concept. And that means being able to resource countries to deliver, you know, the renewable energy transition. And it's not even a transition, right, for lots of these places. We have around about 900 million people who don't have access to electricity in the world. So for those people, it's not just about, you know, being able to change from using a fossil intensive fuel to a renewable one. It's about building out electricity infrastructure from scratch. So I think that when we talk about development investment, we need to think about that in terms of climate investment. Now, some of that might come in the form of conditionalities, but rather than a punitive way of delivering development finance for climate and development, I think that we need to look at stronger incentives, you know, from being able to have lower rates of, you know, interest rates for financing for renewable projects, better terms, more concessional financing, expanded grant making for countries that are wanting to implement their nationally determined contributions, which is their sort of climate plans. But in addition, we also need to make the argument against these big fossil fuel investments. You know, we anticipate that in a decade from now, we're going to have a lot of countries that have invested upfront in fossil fuel infrastructure because they can get finance for it. It might give some quick export income, but what they're going to have is stranded assets. They're going to have massive liabilities, which are going to be landing on their balance sheets and making development even harder. So we need to indicate and highlight those risks, but also provide the shortfall now. If those countries are doing that out of desperation to build up their public investment, you know, expenditure, you know, potential, then we need to be expanding the financing, whether that's providing better debt relief for countries who are in distress, whether that's expanding multilateral development bank financing with very concessional terms, whether that's through the, you know, the special drawing rights allocation that happened a couple of years ago. It's technical IMF allocation, but it essentially provided conditionality-free liquidity for countries to respond in the pandemic. There are levers that we can use to provide that breathing space for countries. If we don't do that, then of course they're going to go towards the quick route, which is the fossil-intensive route.
Thank you, Katie. That's brilliant insights. And to Adam, we've got a question for you from Eric. How can we ensure that funding practices are smarter to guarantee that the needs of the communities that we are trying to serve are met?
Thank you, Eric, for the question. So I think a couple of different thoughts on that, and I'd like to link this to the theme of shifting the power within the sector, and I think traditionally the aid system has been far too top down, and where we need to get to is a system which is much more accountable to the populations where projects are based. And through that, we need to ensure that much more of that development and humanitarian financing is available directly to community-based organizations, local and national organizations. And in order to do that, I think there's a few, one of the big barriers to that at the moment is around the the sort of the heavy risk management culture within the sector and the system, whether it's counter-terrorism legislation, sanctions, the raft of rules and regulations that donors have, the UN, even INGOs like my own, which makes it incredibly challenging to for partners to be sat around the local partners to be sat around the table and to be influencing the design of projects. And so for me, that's in order to design more impactful projects, more accountable projects, more sustainable projects, we really need to make progress as a sector on shifting the power and decision making and resources to local national organizations.
Open up the floor again in case if there's anyone who has any further questions. Yeah, we'll take the man in the check shirt and the second row.
Thank you. Katie, you've been talking quite a bit about what's been needed so countries don't go towards stranded assets. The Minister's answer to that was basically the Bridgetown agenda. That's where I think the UK government seems to be focused at the moment. Do you think that is enough, or do you think there are other things that need to be kind of done as well in order not to go down that fossil fuel route?
Thank you, great question. I was very excited when I heard the Minister bring up Bridgetown, because I wasn't sure and it was illuminating for me to hear him talk so much about it, because I didn't realise that the UK were prioritising it so much. So just as a quick explainer for anyone who hasn't been following that discussion, because understandably, we get busy with the day job, but the Bridgetown agenda was proposed by Prime Minister Mia Mottley. Now, some of you might remember her speech from COP26, where she berated the leaders of advanced economies for being able to pump $17 trillion into the global economy to protect their economies and people during pandemic, but couldn't trump up $100 billion for climate finance for countries facing the sharp edge of climate impacts. Now, her and her team have proposed a 3-point or 4-point agenda, depending on who you speak to. It changes, it's a moving beast. But it essentially tries to provide a point-by-point step towards, okay, we have the challenge of mitigation, which is energy transition. We have the challenge of adaptation, which is building resilience. And we have the challenge of loss and damage. How are we going to finance those three when they need very different sources of financing? The first one, mitigation, probably mostly private sector with some public sector. The second one, resilience, shouldn't come from the private sector. It needs to be public finance, because that's not a profit-making enterprise. And the last one, loss and damage, needs to be completely grants, because that's not going to, it's not going to cut it to put countries even more in debt when they're facing devastation that can be multiple times their GDP. So this agenda is now leading to a summit in June, which is held between the French government and the Barbadian government, and now also the Indian government, because they are leading the G20 this year. And it attempts to lay out a reform of the global financial system. Now, I think it's very promising. I think it's very exciting. I don't think it does everything. I don't think it addresses all the problems that countries are facing. Number one, debt distress. I think there are, as I said, 60% of countries are in or on the edge of debt distress. The only reason more countries haven't defaulted is because they're draining their public budgets to pay people like BlackRock and Vanguard, rather than paying for the education of their children. And that's just in order to keep themselves afloat, because a crash is more dangerous for them in our topsy-turvy world. The second thing, I think, is, what about countries that don't have built-out electricity already? The proposal for mitigation is for, big emerging markets like India, like others who are coal producers or already exporting fossil fuels like Nigeria. What about if you are a tiny country that doesn't have any access to fossil fuels and you don't have that sort of energy infrastructure? Where's the finance for you? So I think it's very promising. I think considering the amount of support it's got from both the G7 countries and developing countries, it's the best we've got, but we need to strengthen it for those countries that fall through the cracks.
Thank you, Katie. And one last question I've got for all of you is, what are the sorts of transformations we need to see in global economic governance if we are to take seriously ambitions for the Sustainable Development Goals and climate commitments? I'll hand it over to Lewis first.
That's a big one. Yeah. I mean, we're going through a very challenging situation at the moment globally with the inflation situation in many countries, post-pandemic costs as well, and so on. So it was really welcome to hear the Minister earlier today articulate the continued commitment of the UK government towards eradicating poverty. And for me and for us at BRAC, as to ensure that we continue as the global system wholly focuses on eradicating extreme poverty. That's the fundamental thing that we need to do. SDG 1 is number one for a reason. 1.1 is the eradication of extreme poverty. That is the most important. And as the Minister said, with 100 million more people living in extreme poverty, it's fundamental that the system focuses on that at this time. Thank you.
Thank you. And Katie?
Could you repeat the question? Apologies.
What are the sorts of transformations we need to see in global economic governance if we are to take seriously ambitions for the Sustainable Development Goals?
I've got lots of opinions about this. I wanted to say some of them, particularly on, debt. We have, if you are facing bankruptcy as an individual, you have a formal legal process that you go through to figure that out. If you're a business facing bankruptcy, same thing. If you're a country, good luck. It's informal, it's not transparent, it's at the behest of your creditors. That isn't democratic. That's not a rules-based order. So we need a rules-based way of figuring out debt distress. We need a multilateral debt workout system because these, many countries who are on the edge of catastrophe and have been for now years, who are getting by, month to month from their finance ministries, they need a long-term solution. Otherwise, development out the window. Climate goals out the window. So I think that's one key thing. I think the WTO, I know that this is obviously we're talking about development, but when we look at successful examples of development historically, they have all been achieved, and now this is me coming from my UNCTAD perspective, through structural transformation, whereby countries move from working in commodity export and agricultural export to being able to upgrade to manufacturing and services. Now, we need a different development pathway because that's too fossil intensive. But if we are serious about a low carbon development trajectory, we need to be talking about trade too. And at the moment, the risk at the World Trade Organization is that all the rich countries get to break the rules. They get to do these big industrial policy initiatives to make sure that they are leaders in the green tech race, that they are, already positioned well in the future economy we're going to have. Meanwhile, all the developing countries are stuck in the same position. Probably in a worse position, whether that's if you've got lithium, you're going to export lithium. If you don't, you're probably just going to be in the same situation. So we need to be thinking about the trade rules and to make sure that those countries who have suffered under existing trade rules through rising inequality, through multinational companies being able to be there but not pay any taxes, those sorts of loopholes need to be closed, and those countries need a fairer exchange so that they can have the sorts of futures that we want for our own country.
Thank you, Katie. And Adam, any final words on the sorts of transformations we need to see in global economic governance?
Not necessarily my area of expertise, but two thoughts. One is this is primarily about social justice at the global level or the national level, and I think that's what we need to stay focused on. Reducing inequality, addressing poverty. We're not going to achieve the SDGs unless we tackle climate justice, unless we tackle unfair trade and tax systems around the world. Secondly, I do worry that, with, conversations on, new approaches, we've heard quite a bit about the sort of the Bridgetown agenda today. I do worry that you hear from some commentators about trying to do more with less. And I do worry that that's not going to have a great outcome for the poorest people around the world. And so how can we make sure that you know, we finance, and there's enough finance in the system in order to address sustainably poverty and inequality challenges?
Report to all our panellists here today who've given wonderful insights. We'll now be taking a break until 12 noon, so please make your way downstairs for tea and coffee, and you can return here at 12 o'clock for our next panel. commence the next panel, now on change at the top, political support for global redistribution. The next discussion will tackle political leadership. What political support do we want to see for our sector, and what can be done to encourage a renewed commitment to global redistribution and the Sustainable Development Goals? And of course, what will be our key asks of our next First Minister? To address these questions and more, please welcome Paolo Marini, Senior Research Fellow for the Development Engagement Lab, William Worley, UK Correspondent at DevEx, and virtually we'll have Enoch Nyawoka Twinobuya, Senior Economist at the Sustainable Development Goals Centre for Africa, and our very own Francis Guy, Chief Executive of Scotland's International Development Alliance. So let's start off with some opening words and tell us a bit more about the work you do. From Paolo, could you let us know a little bit more about the work that you do?
First of all, thanks so much for having me here in Glasgow and at this event. It's been extraordinary so far. I'm a researcher for a project which is called Development Engagement Lab. We're based in London, at University College London, and in Birmingham, at the University of Birmingham. We work with more than 100 charities, NGOs, government agencies in the UK, France, Germany, the United States, and increasingly we're branching out, so we're now in Ireland, we are in Canada, and soon enough we'll be in Japan, which is the furthest we've reached with our surveying and public opinion analysis. Broadly, our question is one of understanding public opinion and public attitudes towards development, sustainable development, global poverty, and global issues at large, including pandemics, climate change, and any that you might quote yourself. We have been active now for almost a decade, and we are keeping on feeding what we call the base of insights and evidence to inform development communications, and more in general to understand what drives public engagement with the issues such as global poverty and sustainable development.
Thanks, Paolo. And William, could you say a few words for us about the work that you do?
Helps when the mic's on, doesn't it? I'm a reporter with an organisation called DevEx. We provide specialist news and independent journalism on international development and also humanitarian policy. We cover food systems, development finance, global health in particular. So do look those up if you don't know us already. I myself have been covering the UK since 2020, which has been a bit of a rocky ride for UK development, and some of you may know me from my reporting on the UK aid cuts, and I'm now sort of following the FCDO under its new leadership under Adam Mitchell and seeing how things go.
I'm going to, I think Enoch, we've got Enoch joining us virtually. He's the Senior Economist at the Sustainable Development Goals Centre of Africa. Enoch, hello, how are you? Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear. I hope
fantastic.
You can hear me. So my name's Enoch Nyawoka Twinobuya. I work for the Sustainable Development Goals Center for Africa, which was constituted at or conceived at the UN General Assembly in 2015 as the SDGs were adopted. And it was adopted with a guiding mission to assist African countries to achieve national and subnational targets for sustainable development goals by 2030. And this goal was shared by all African leaders and aligned, and it's in the same vein that the incoming chair at the time, Paul Kagame, His Excellency, agreed to host the center in Kigali, and we've since opened sub-regional offices in other places. But our main areas of work are policy advisory, research and education, as well as innovative solutions for sustainable development, particularly in monitoring and evaluation as well.
Thank you, Enoch. And last but not least, we've got Francis. He's going to tell us a bit more about the Scotland International Development Alliance.
I was actually just going to go straight into the question, but I am happy to tell you something about us. I'm hoping that you all know something about us, that you're here today because you're a member of Scotland's International Development Alliance, and if you're not, please do join us. We like to think that we're an organisation that represents everyone in Scotland interested in international development. That is NGOs, small and large, but also is universities, researchers, students, social enterprises, and hopefully some members of the private sector. We heard a little bit about how useful their money might be in this space. I was accused that we were a bit pie in the sky by a journalist the other day looking for Scotland for a fairer world, but I think it's good to have high ambitions for a just world. So we are doing our best to help work with you all to work for a better world. Yes, thank you.
Fantastic. And I just want to remind everyone in the room that you can feel free to post your questions using Slido or online or via your phones. And if you do have a question, you can feel free to put your hand up as well at any time to ask one of the panelists. I'm going to kick off, though, with a question myself, actually, to Paolo. How important is public opinion in driving political support for the sector? And what can those of us in the room do to increase public support for development and global redistribution?
That's a big question, one that I particularly like. I think part of it was already touched upon in the speech by the minister. At the end of the day, the public is the ultimate gatekeeper, is the ultimate agent in this kind of conversation. So where there's public support for certain kind of policies, even in the foreign policy realm, then there will be government action. And this increasingly is the consensus both in academic research, but also in our insights from what we've studied in Development Engagement Lab. I think here there is a lot of questions about what the organizations can do and what members can do and what governments can do. We have a bulk of evidence now on what drives public support, and we know that these are arguments that are based on the morality of the action, so saying it's important to do it, it's the right thing to do, we should help because we can, this kind of arguments, and this really resonates very strongly, especially with the UK audience. And then there are arguments which are based on cost and benefits and the efficacy of aid as an instrument to solve an issue, which is global poverty, for example. So if you look at it this way, right, then you think there is a combination of both, and both drive it, right? So pushing on these buttons will help the publics in the country that you work in understand the kind of mission that you do. And perhaps our main insight is really that the arguments based on morality, based on the values, based on a view of the world are the ones that are really effective at driving support, and that's where good, effective communication can be done to the public to really strengthen the cause of the work that you do. The cost and benefits, you will have heard Minister Mitchell is very keen on thinking that this will drive support for the people that are on the fence, so this 50-50 split. Our evidence so far is mixed. It's something that we're investigating. We don't have a final answer to that, but just as a few points, we do ask a question to a lot of the UK people whether they think that the main finality of aid given from the UK should be to reduce poverty, do a combination of reducing poverty and serving national interest, or serving national interest first, and the vast majority, which is 1 in 2, say it's reduction of poverty. And incidentally, if you cross that with levels of support and you go look at people that says it should support our national interest first, those are not people that are supportive of aid. So pushing on that button might be a way of gaining some support for people that are on the fence, perhaps, but we're not talking about large groups. So it's a difficult road to walk, not necessarily an impossible one to walk, but at the same time, it's an interesting question that we're looking more into. I think that's broadly it, but I could talk for another 6 hours.
And William, I mean, being a correspondent yourself, how important do you think public opinion is in driving political support for the sector?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important. It's not just the Paolo and the DEL and the minister thinking about this. Lots of NGOs, as I'm sure you're all aware, are very kind of concerned about public opinion. I feel that the closure of DFID might not have gone the way it did if, and the aid cuts as well, for that matter, if public opinion had been a bit different and a bit more kind of solidly in favour of aid, but we kind of need to remember as well the context, the time in which those things happened. The government did it during the COVID pandemic when everyone was basically very concerned about their own well-beings and the impact on their own lives. There wasn't a lot of bandwidth for people to kind of think about policy things which are a bit further away from them. And it was very hard for, I think, the development sector to kind of mobilize in that context as well. Whether they would have pulled that move in a different time, maybe the results would have been a bit different.
Can I pick him up on that? I would like to suggest, well, many of you will be familiar with the fact that the Alliance has long argued for more policy coherence across government, and for this idea that we own things that we do at home and the impact that it has abroad. And I think that COP26 was hosted in Glasgow in the middle of the pandemic. And the work that was done, in communities all around Scotland to create that sense that we were all part of this, of something that was global, that had a global impact, was really important. And I think there was genuine public ownership for that idea. I fear that we've lost some of that momentum, but I think it's a good example of what is possible when the public are kind of half bought into the idea, people make a lot of noise and communicate it really well, and local communities and government put in a bit of money so that local communities can do a piece. So I don't think it was necessarily that during the pandemic they kind of snuck it in. I think we could have made a bit more noise about it. So I'm agreeing with you that there was maybe space for the public opinion to make more noise, and I think that COP26 is a good example that you can do that. Thank you.
And Enoch, what are your views on how important public opinion is in driving political support for the sector?
No, I think we live in an era of democracy, and the public opinion should not only swing leadership changes, it should also be embedded into the policy changes that happen thereafter. This starts from planning, it starts from implementation, audit oversight, accountability, and so it's a really important issue. And we live in
It's just frozen there. So we're going to go on to another question that we've actually received online, which is, how positive should we feel about the prospect of the UK Labour government? Paolo, would you like to start?
Well, if you're asking for a pundit on the chances of a UK Labour government happening, then the polls at the moment say it's fairly possible, if not practically a reality coming up. If you want a perspective of a person that studies public opinion and how it intersects with politics, I think it's going to be an important change in the narrative and in the things that we talk about when Labour takes over the UK government, if it does. Just to give you two examples of what I mean when I say that there is a large, if not the largest difference between the opinion of people that support Labour and Conservatives on a series of issues connected with this. You've heard the Minister say that the split in people that support aid is 50-50 at the moment. It is about 70% of Labour supporters that think we should keep or increase the level of expenditure of aid. That compares to about 30% for a Conservative supporter. We've asked a similar question about the aid cuts. Again, you will not be surprised. Most of the Conservatives respondents thought it was the right thing to do at the time. They would cut it again if the reason to do so would arise. And most importantly, which I think is one for us to really communicate better to our audience, Conservatives do not hold their government to account on the promise that they made to restore to 0.7 when the fiscal situation allows it. Polling says they don't mind. Either way is fine. This is 100% the problem for this audience, so to speak, that we need to unpack. When it comes to Labour, most Labour supporters instead hold the government to account. So there's clearly a lot more appetite for restoring 0.7 in left-wing audiences. The SNP, because we're in Scotland, it's a bit 50-50 on everything. Both support for aid, concern for global poverty, and the view on the cats. There are a lot more either or. It's not as clear-cut as Labour and Conservatives are. They seem to be sitting in between those two groups. So it's another audience which has not yet completely made up its mind on these issues.
And William, what's your thoughts on this?
So the data kind of has a bit of a left and right kind of split, but even within Labour, there is a bit of, it's not kind of completely agreed with it, their approach to restoring 0.7, how they are going to be restoring the new model of their structural phrase for the department, which definitely won't be called DFID. For unknown reasons, there are sensitivities around that name. David Lammy is the shadow foreign secretary. He's quite a very powerful figure within the Labour Party, and it does appear to some on the outside that he has been sort of stepping into the patch of Preet Gill, who leads the development brief a little bit. At times they've said contradictory things. He's also been a bit less bullish on returning to 0.7. He said he's basically copied government language saying that the economy is too turbulent, it will go back when the fiscal situation allows. Whereas where Preet Gill laid out quite a solid plan, we're going to have day one, we are going to have a review of the finances, we will set out a pathway to 0.7 as soon as we get into power. Quite a clearly defined plan, which David Lammy doesn't seem to have picked up on. So even if Labour do get in, there are still going to be things to watch, and policy items which they will need to be held to account on.
Thanks, William. And Francis, do you have any thoughts on this, or?
I don't have anything to add to that. I think David Lammy is very cautious on it, and he did a speech recently at Chatham House where he completely ducked all the questions on 0.7%. So I fear that that's a task for us all, actually, in the next 18 months or so, that we should be at least making it clear that there are a large chunk of the population, even if it's 50-50, who think this is important. Thank you.
And I see we've got Enoch back now. So I've actually got a question that's come in specifically for Enoch. And it's, what can we in Scotland learn from progress on SDGs in African countries?
Okay. There's a lot to learn, but I'll pick a few. I'll start with maybe the question you're talking about, the 0.7% and what it means for Africa. In a recent study with the SDSN, their estimations as well as the IMF, showing how much Africa needs in terms of additional financing. And it needs currently as much as it in collective terms that it collects from all sources. So that's in terms of additional financing, be able to meet sustainable development goals. And the gap is as large as about $500 billion per annum. And this is just, if you compare it with the global size of economic activities, it's less than 1%. So meaning that it's something that is feasible. And within that, the emphasis is actually that the OECD commitment should be met. It's looked at as a clear mechanism or financing mechanism towards realizing the financing gap. In terms of what we see the African continent and what we've seen, for example, almost all African economies have endorsed SDGs at a political level, at a high level, either at a presidential level or prime minister level, and they have incorporated SDGs into national strategies. We've seen that about 80% of African countries have a leading coordinating unit, either an independent unit or as part of the planning or finance ministry. We also see establishment of coordination mechanisms that represent both interministerial as well as technical committees, but also involve a number of multi-stakeholder players, including development partners, where discussion on finance comes in. We also have representation both from central government, but also the lower local governments, as well as CSO representation and the private sector. And in some instances, these have actually been critical in leveraging resources. We saw during COVID when there were financing constraints, that these mechanisms were able to leverage short-term resources towards combating some of these. We've also seen innovations coming through the private sector collaboration with government to develop monitoring and evaluation mechanisms. One of the challenges that we see at African continent, actually when we evaluate and do a survey of challenges, we tend to see 3 or 4 issues coming through. One is the financing constraint. The other is the statistical capacity is still lacking, and data is a challenge. And if you can't measure, you can't plan effectively for it. But we see that those are the main fundamental challenges. And of course, given that we still have a youthful population, the human capital challenge is still a very large and structured problem that we have to deal with. But over and above, I think to summarize the point there is that national ownership and domestication of SDGs, the custodian of governments, and governments in Africa have fully owned up and integrated into the national development plans. The main issue now is in terms of implementing, which requires enhanced capacity, enhanced revenue, and enhanced collaboration as stipulated into the SDG framework. What we also see is that, of course, the role of government or even implementation of SDGs depends on effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions as embedded in SDG 16. And this is where I think Africa still has a challenge also in terms of institutional effectiveness. So for Scotland, I think the issue is that if you can promote effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions, it will be critical in not only leveraging resources, but also delivery of the development agenda.
I want to open up the floor for anyone who has a question. Just feel free to put up your hand, and I'll go around the room and someone will come with a mic. Yes, the lady in the 3rd row with the blazer.
Thank you. I'm wondering, when the public opinion and your goals or the right thing to do are sort of mismatched, what strategies have been successful in aligning them together?
So let me see if I get your question right. You say if the public thinks that we should give aid because it's the right thing to do, but are they doubting that we're making enough progress?
If there is a mismatch or a kind of a conflict of interest between what is the right thing to do and the public opinion, what strategies have been successful in aligning them together?
It's more of a policy angle to that. I think what we mean when we say it's the right thing to do is that people hold the idea of helping each other as the right thing to do. It's not necessarily about the implementation of something specific itself. So it's not just about aid, it's about caring about poverty, it's about caring about climate change and saying we should do something about it because we can. If people are put in front of the difficulty, so to speak, between choosing what is right and what needs to be done, then they might develop other structures in terms of attitudes and opinion that tries to balance out that in their mind. But really, the point is that increasingly people are understanding that these are global challenges and we're all on the same side. So as an example, when we polled people in times of climate change and with COVID, and we asked them, do you think cooperation is ever more important? More and more people agree with this. So that conflict of interest is becoming less important, at least in the minds of people. And yeah, there will always be cases in which somebody will try and roll it back and say we need to care about ourselves first. But at least in our polling data, that is becoming the rare occasion more than the norm. I know I'm skirting a little bit around it, but it's because we look less about policy implementation and more about what the public thinks in the situations.
Yep, thank you. I've got loads of questions coming in online for the panel. We've got one here. What would the Scottish Government do to prioritise progress on SDGs? Sorry, what should they do to prioritise progress on SDGs? And are any of the panel willing to comment on which First Minister candidate is likely to drive this the most? Let's start with Will.
I'll dare as a Scottish voice on the panel, perhaps. I mentioned at the very beginning that they launched the National Performance Framework consultation this week, so I think the Scottish Government could do more to own all of that, could do more to speak, to actually, this bit, we're talking about communications. I doubt that there are that many people, except for a couple of civil servants, who actually know that there is this National Performance Framework and that is supposed to be being implemented at local government level and all around the place, and that we are way behind on implementing the SDGs here as much as, not maybe as much, but equally as other places. It's a global endeavour, and I think we could do, and the government could do a lot more to show leadership in saying that it's a global endeavour. We heard very clearly in a separate meeting with FCDO officials that the British government will not be doing a voluntary national review, which is the kind of reporting mechanism to the UN on implementing SDGs. The UK has done one. I think Rwanda's done at least 3, and Enoch can correct me. Other countries have done even more. We've done 1, and this government is clear that they are not going to do another one before the election. We are at, as I said, at the halfway point. This is the ideal point to do a stock take of where we're at. If the UK government's not willing to do it, we could do a voluntary local review. The UN are encouraging local, regional governments and municipalities to do local reviews. The Basque country government does one every year. I agree that that could be a lot of work, but it would be something that's worth looking at to see whether we could own this process a bit more. Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any SNP MPs here? No. I mean, it's interesting that the Scottish independence debate has been driven by a disconnect between Whitehall, but it was the FCDO minister that showed up to the event. The SNP one MP has been active on the International Development Committee, but I guess a bit of engagement with events like this might be a good place to start. On the owning the political ownership of development-related agendas, it's the funding that Scotland provided for loss and damage at COP26, it was only £1 to £2 million, but it has paid huge political dividends. I thought that was a pretty clever piece of politics by Nicola Sturgeon. She's famous for that world over now among the kind of the climate community. So I guess even though it's a smaller country, there are clever things you can do and opportunities that you can take.
Paolo, do you have any thoughts on it? Oh, no. I would like to go back to the audience now to take questions. I'm going to go to the gentleman right at the back with the maroon shirt. He's got his hand up.
Thank you. Thanks. Hi panel. I'm Lewis from Oxfam Scotland. This week Oxfam published an inclusive language guide that some of you may have seen. Interestingly, it's not gone down well in all quarters, but then we never expected it to. I suppose this is an area that the Alliance has also worked on, language, its importance, how we define things like the word aid itself. Is that even appropriate in 2023? My question to you is, if we wholesale change the way we talk about this sector and what it means and really decolonized our language and our processes, would that help shift public opinion?
I'm happy to talk a little bit about that because we've been trying to understand where public opinion is at on issues of better language, really, and being more inclusive and decolonizing, which is one of the things you quoted. At least the UK and the French public, they're not there yet, which I want to premise. It's not a way for me to say, don't do this. I think we definitely need to do it, but it needs to be done in a way that onboards people with the discussion and explains the meaning of the shift in language. if we put it to people and we just literally just simply ask them, what do you call the process by which money gets transferred from net donors to net recipients, and which of these languages would you use for it? People will revert to standard. Poor countries are called poor countries, development aid is called aid, and all the more enlightened, more inclusive, and by any means not harder options, they just do not get picked. And I think it's because there's less of a reactance to it. It's not because people don't want to do it, it's because they're so used and it's been so drilled so deeply into their brains that if you want to disengage that, then it will really take a little bit more. As an example, though, of things that you can be doing, and we were talking with Francis about that a minute ago, we commissioned a study about gender and development recently, and when and how does it help to frame policy as gender inclusive or with the aim of addressing gender equality or even as feminist. So you see a degree of pushing the boat out. And in the UK, for example, as soon as you label something which has got to do with aid as feminist or gender inclusive or aimed at gender, it reduces support immediately, significantly. It goes down under the 50% line and it doesn't carry. But as long as you explain it or even contextualize it or put it as a part of a set of policy packages, and so don't just talk about gender, but talk about the implications that the gender has for education as a priority or health as a priority for women, then support doesn't move. And it's okay. Can you win support by changing the language? We have some evidence that people understand that this is a need. When we put them in front of images that we use in the campaigns that a lot of charities and NGOs in the sector rely on, if you ask them, what do you think is the best description of a place that people call a poor country, then people tend to choose images that are much less stereotypical, much less aggressively demeaning of the people that they're depicting. But, and this is the weird bit, if you say, now imagine you're the person in charge of picking the image for the campaign, they revert back to the stereotype. They know the need for it. People are sophisticated in understanding these debates, perhaps more than we give them credits as audience. But at the same time, that's what I mean when I say there needs to be a conversation, and the Scottish International Development Alliance has got another guide, right, which we've relied on to build that study as well. So this conversation is happening within the sector. It clearly needs to be brought out, and we know that people will be appreciative of it. And Oxfam as well has done some campaigning with different kind of messages. WaterAid has used kind of different messengers which are working in the net recipient world, and that worked very well. So there is scope.
Do any of the other panelists want to have a word? Enoch, would you like to speak about the importance of language in winning public opinion, like the use of dropping the word aid, for example?
I think the previous speaker did have my mind. We've been doing at the SDG Center, doing citizen reports, and these we present them in simplified formats for ease of understanding for the citizens. And what we've seen is that before we did this, we had the baseline survey where we did try to understand the level of understanding of sustainable development goals with 3 dimensions, which is growth, social inclusion, and environment. And what we've seen is that over the years, following the 2 or 3 citizen reports that we've produced, we've seen increased awareness and appreciation, and as well as adopting some of the SDG good practices, particularly on environment, by the citizens. So it does, the language does matter. As you know, the quality of public opinion also depends on the level of understanding. Understanding, in there lies the relevance of language.
Open it up again to the audience because we've got quite a few questions. Can I get the lady in the red blazer on the 4th row, please?
Thank you. This is kind of a question to William, I guess. I think most of us in this room have probably been tasked with trying to get a story about the work we do into, the media, and or meeting with MPs or MSPs. Do you have any advice on how we get our excellent projects out there, our recommendations, our asks for politicians? How do we frame them to become easier to understand, or with the media become newsworthy stories where we might get into a conversation with the public or with our MPs on these important projects that we all work on?
So I can't speak to the political engagement side of things, but for the media, it is, I admit, really, really tricky. I remember when I was a freelancer trying to get stories commissioned about development-related issues was very tricky. Even though I thought it was, what was going on was really important. So I completely sympathize with your position. And, we're lucky now. I'm kind of working for an organization that takes a bit of a different view, but, newspaper editors and journalists get so many kind of requests. What it does help is providing new information, original data that also says something, not just, is a bit dull, but is actually saying something about an issue of the current moment. For instance, I received, after the integrated review came out and it was announced that CSSF, the Conflict, Stability and Security Fund, was going to be closed or merged. I know there's certain connotations with that word, merger. I haven't published this yet, but I'm working on the story. I was sent some data by an organization on aid cuts to peace-building programs, and they kind of shown the trend of how there's been less money has gone into that since 2018. And I thought that was really interesting for me because it's an issue that I've been covering for a long time. It provided new information, and it's something that's worthy of further publication. All too often we kind of get press releases which are just bland kind of reaction lines that just don't really say anything and don't relate necessarily to what that organization has done. So I'd encourage you to kind of pick and choose your moments with these things.
Thanks, Will. We've got some more questions coming in online, actually. So Vicky asks, it's easy to think Keir Starmer will come back to power and restore DFID and take us all back to the good old days. But what risks of complacency or even nostalgia could there be? Who wants to go first? What are the risks of complacency or even nostalgia if Keir Starmer does come back to power? Yeah, sure.
I mean, I touched on this a bit earlier, but I think the development question within Labour is still unresolved. I think there are internal discussions, fights going on within Labour as to what their line is on certain things and who controls what. And I guess as we kind of creep closer to a general election and their manifesto gets written and things get solidified, that process will be, I would have thought, would resolve its place, but maybe it won't. Maybe that won't be fully resolved by the time of the next election, and assuming they win the next election, that is a fight that kind of continues in government. If that is the case, that could get, fairly problematic.
I'm going to hand it back to the floor now because there's more questions. I'll take, there's a lady right at the back with a hand up. Yeah, stand here.
I'm a student at the University of Glasgow. My name is Octaber. I recently had some discussions with frontline workers in NHS and some people working with the police, for example. Some of them work at soup kitchens. And with the war right now, what is more real and more important for them is to address local needs, for example, increased homelessness and increased poverty in Glasgow. And so from the conversations I've drawn that they do not think that international development or the government setting aside any funds towards any international cause is at all important. And some of them believe this aggressively, to the point that I don't know what the solution to this is, because obviously I understand that domestic issues are obviously not, separate from international issues. But then if you're talking about public support for bringing political change and getting global support, we need to also understand what factions of the public we're talking about and how we loop them in, and whether their opinions should be taken in. I mean, obviously they should, but how they should be molded into support for international development and such causes. Yeah.
Thank you for that question. Who would like to address the question? Paolo.
Of course, exclamation mark. Your immediate concerns and your local sphere within which you exist, it's inevitably, and for good reasons, what you're going to care the most about. That doesn't mean your concern ends there, so that's where messaging and engagement comes in. I think it's Andrew Mitchell's old battle horse that charity begins at home, but it doesn't have to end there. It's the kind of messaging that I think we'll hear more and more about coming out of the International Development and Africa Ministry. If you go in putting it as a trade-off, then of course that won't work. And when we ask that question as would you think we should prioritize home or abroad, then people are like, well, of course, there's a lot happening here. But actually people understand increasingly the connection, which is, I think, the point I was trying to make before, and understand that certain issues are not necessarily national or foreign. They move across the borders, and that's why we need to action and do something about them. I think the gains there is that for people that have this kind of gut reactions is to try and understand their awareness and the way the things are happening around them are shaping international and domestic policy. And as an example, because we brought up SDG, we did ask people, do you know that the SDGs apply to everybody? And most people just say, I don't know. It's far past the days in which people said, no, it's just for poor countries. So we've moved to step one, so to speak. We've created uncertainty. We haven't made people aware of the real nature of the SDG as a policy agenda. But people can be receptive to this. And in general, there is no evidence that people have no other way of engaging with this. So if the question is, do you think we should increase aid by a lot, then maybe support for that in the UK might be mixed, but it doesn't mean people are not concerned about poverty in other countries. It doesn't mean people are not concerned about sustainable development. And so that's where you bring them in, and that's where you find warm audiences that are sitting kind of on the fence and start to build a dialogue or a kind of insight-based approach to bringing them on board with some of the work that you do. We can't convert everybody. Again, I think it's another one of Mitchell's favorite things. We go from 50-50 to 70-30, but that's plenty. And with something that is backed by the government and that the government really endorses, you can get there. I think what's missing at the moment is that the UK government it's neither nor. It's not communicating and embracing these kind of things as something that we can own, unless you get the development superpower narrative, which is not really helpful for the person that, as you say, works for the NHS in Glasgow or is a policeman in South Scotland. That is my opinion on it.
Yep, Francis.
Just to say, I think there is a space for global solidarity. I'm very struck. I used to think that it was a very wishy-washy term, but when you ask, I had the honour of meeting some Iraqi women not so long ago. We've failed Iraqi women, let's be honest. But when you ask them what they want, what they really still would appreciate is solidarity, is people speaking out. And I think it's possible to share that idea that we're all part of something the same, whether it's the SDGs, whether it's climate change, whether it's something like World Hunger Day, and to acknowledge that we have hunger in Glasgow at the same time as people have hunger, possibly other depths of hunger, but have hunger somewhere else, and just share something about that global solidarity at those moments as a way of maybe helping that sentiment. Thank you.
Thanks, Francis. We've had another question come in online, which is which global international political leaders would you applaud for their approach to international development? I'll start with Enoch. Is there any particular leader you think you would applaud for their approach in international development?
I think they're quite a number, but I don't know whether you classify Professor Jeffrey Sachs as a global leader, but he's been a champion of SDGs from the time of the design and has been a voice of global partnerships and solidarity, like the previous speaker was saying. So I think for me, that would be one of them. On the African continent, I still would applaud His Excellency Paul Kagame. First, as the incoming chair for the African Union at the time in 2015, he did champion the setup of the SDG Center for Africa and was a critical voice for both that the agenda cannot be delivered without the global partnerships, and has been, if you look at Rwanda itself, even when I visit Rwanda, I find it a very organized and given the resources they have made quite sizable improvements, and every year the leaders, ministers are accountable to the citizens. Again, this is where the voice of the citizen comes in. So I think there are a couple of those leaders that I would pick up. Of course, I would not forget that Amina Mahmoud, who's been at the UN, who's been a great voice also for sustainable development goals. So those are some of the global players that I could pick out.
Enoch, who would like to to go next with who they would admire or applaud within the global political leaders, or it could be even anyone who you think is actually doing great work within the sector? Yeah, Will.
I think given the minister's repeated references to the Bridgetown agenda, it's hard to ignore the impact of Mia Mottley. And she's a couple of years ago, not many people knew who she was. COP26. I was in the room when she made her keynote speech, and she was the only thing I heard all week, which really had people on the edges of their seats and had their attention. And she's made a lot of progress since then. And I don't know the population of Barbados, but I imagine it's pretty small. It's a very small country, and so what she's been able to achieve, shaping the development finance reform agenda, through this year is a really big deal.
Thanks, Will. How about you, Paolo?
I have to say I struggled a little bit with thinking properly about this. If I can be broader, then I would say there is a lot of exciting stuff that is happening in France at the French Agency for Development, so not necessarily within the Macron area of policy making, but just to give you two examples that speak to the debates that we've been having. First, their full embrace of feminist development policy, or as I call it, feminist diplomacy, and how they're pushing this as one of their key priorities, but not in a ways that just says we have this priority and then it's not matched up by words. It really is center stage on everything they communicate with the public. And the second, which is, again, interestingly around language as well, and their expanding commitments as the French government tries to gather a sense of leadership in this policy arena. It's also this idea that now everything that they do it with this idea in mind that they're building a world in common. And so again, it's a process of moving the language forward and trying to push it as an approach which is moving away from development and trying to achieve these objectives because they matter in and of itself. And it's also the same France, though, that is still struggling a lot with the Sahel and with understanding Africa and France as a relationship which is complicated and that cannot bring itself to talk about African countries, but always refers to Africa as a continent, as a monolithic thing. So it's a complicated discussion. And the other things that I really like and enjoy is everything that comes from the sector here in the UK. I work at Disasters Emergency Committee at the moment, and I think the push that some of the NGOs and charities and organizations do to really engage the public with issues going beyond Ukraine is also like mesmerizing, incredible, outstanding, wonderful, almost scary for how much they manage to achieve. So that's what inspires me, and that's what I think it's interesting going on around us.
Thanks, Paolo, for sharing that. And Francis, any thoughts? No?
Seeing as you're pushing me, I was always inspired by Ecuadorians who have the best system of gender responsive budgeting in the world and are completely undersold, but I don't think that counts as leadership because it's in a very small sector. So I can't think of anybody who's had that kind of impact globally, so sorry.
And I'd like to open up the floor again because I think we have some more questions. I'll take the man in the third row. Sorry, the mic's just coming.
Thank you so much. My question is I'll direct this question to the gentleman who deals in health sector. I've noticed that there's been a lot of shortage of health workers in hospitals, in particular NHS. And my concern is that this is affecting both the patients and also the health personnel, especially that they have to work maybe ×2 instead of working maybe 12 hours. They have to go back and work maybe ×2. So my question is anything you can do to reduce this or to help the government maybe to employ people who are trained so that they can reduce this impact?
Right, who's that question addressed to, sorry? Is that
Sorry,
to...
I was saying my concern is for people who are working in the health sector and the patients. There's been a lot of shortage in terms of health personnel in hospitals. So my concern is that people are overworking themselves, meaning that their quality of health is not good, and also the patients, they are not having a good quality health exercises. So I was thinking, is there anything you can do to improve this or to reduce the shortage of staff?
So I'm wondering, the broader sense, there's probably any NGOs or anything who could get probably involved with issues relating to healthcare. I think that's probably more for the government, I'd say, and maybe less for the panelists to address. But it's a brilliant question and something that could be probably addressed in a later conference. I'm going to go and go to another question as well from the panel. We've got a lady right at the front here as well who likes to ask a question.
Thank you. My question is to Francis. I just wanted to ask the role of Scotland's International Development Alliance in terms of working with the Scottish Government. Are there any avenues or opportunities for a community like us to get information or funding, advice, or are there any programs which we can benefit from your side? Thank you very much.
I think you're about to hear from Joanna about different programs and fundings that are available. Yes, we work quite closely and we have a constant dialogue about that. We lobby for more clarity and transparency on the funding. And we are also working, we've done quite a lot of work on the government's commitment to a wellbeing and sustainable development bill. Because in the 21-22 programme for government, the Scottish Government made a lot of very ambitious commitments. And I think this panel was to talk about political leadership. What I would like to see from the Scottish Government is follow through on those commitments. And in terms of the Alliance, we've been trying to work on some of those areas that were very clear in that 21-22 programme for government, especially on the Wellbeing and Sustainable Development Bill, but also on their commitment to a feminist approach to global affairs. The government could do more. It's good to have these ambitions, but governments are in a position to implement, and we'd like to see them do more implementation. Thank you.
Thanks, Francis. And we've got one final question that's actually come for Paolo online from Eric Muhia. And it's, with the current political climate, how do you see the UK government prioritising the sustainable development goals in their foreign aid policies?
We've asked a little bit about this to the public, and more in general, we've heard a lot from Andrew Mitchell today. So I think the position is that some of the things that FCDO is prioritizing sits within the Sustainable Development Goals agenda. My point that strikes me the most, though, is that SDGs are clearly not the way this is framed as, and it's not the way people are interfacing with issues like global health or climate change, and the rights of women and girls, which are all part of the SDG agenda. They're just not presented as such sometimes. I think what governments will struggle with is that this issue is at the lowest possible level of awareness in public. So when we ask people if they know about the Sustainable Development Goals, it's about 1 in 10 that say they've heard about it or know about it. So it's very, very low. And that's where probably the challenge for our government communicating this issue comes across. Because you can talk about the issues, but people will be less receptive or understand less when they're about the SDGs. I think that broadly is the largest thing. As I said before, also people are not really understanding that it applies to everybody. So that might be the other downfall of a government trying to communicate these things and prioritize these things in the agenda. On the other hand, what really matters, you might remember a while ago when Liz Truss was still FCDO secretary, she also did a speech on priorities and tried to put forward the issues of technology, the cyber, security as more important priorities for FCDO and foreign policy at large, and those were not well received by audiences, at least in the UK. So although the SDGs might not be present as a label or as a box within which we put our issues in the minds of the public, it doesn't mean that the public don't know that certain things are more important than others. And that is just an idea that might communicate what kind of issues and prioritizing choices is in front of the government when they look at the public.
Thank you, Paolo. And I just want to open up the to the panelists if they have any final words or anything they'd like to add to the discussion today. Will?
Just to follow on to Paolo's point, I was at an event with an FCDO official last week or the week before, and he did say that the department that we could expect more campaigning basically around the SDGs coming this year. But again, like a lot of the discussion I've heard around the SDGs recently has basically been about where have they gone? No one's wearing their badges anymore. Like, it's rock bottom in the public knowledge. So there's clearly work to be done, and if the UK government decide to reopen a conversation about that, maybe that can go some way to changing it.
Thank you, Will, and thanks to all our panelists who've joined us today, to discuss this really important panel, actually. And I just wanted to say, just Francis and Enoch as well, I want to give you the opportunity to say any final words on closing. All fine.
I'd be interested in we had started with this point, but it seems to me that there's lots of lessons to be learned from the political leadership on SDGs from Africa, so I'm happy to hand over that word. Thank you.
Thank you. And Enoch?
Thanks again. I think the implementation of development starts with all of us who are in the room. There's a lot that we can do without even, we can be basically messengers for SDGs to all the other people, particularly for climate change, given the behavior that our behavior in terms of recycling, reusing, and so there's a lot that we can do. I think Francis had mentioned performance frameworks. I think performance frameworks, it's critical that what is in the performance framework should also be explicitly aligned to SDGs. What we've also seen, particularly in some African economies, is to ensure that the fiscal policy also explicitly addresses, on an annual basis, addresses how they are targeting SDGs, more like a certificate of compliance for SDGs. And of course, for Scotland, it would be good to also, I think at some point, if the political buy-in is there, to have a voluntary national review or local review And then, of course, continued mobilization of key stakeholders to ensure that you have the public opinion also reflected in the implementation of any development agenda. I think those are pretty my last submissions.
And thanks. Give a big round of applause to all our panellists who've participated today. They're now going to take their seats, and we're going to call our next speaker, who will be coming now. Thank you. Thank you so much. Lovely to meet you. I'd now like to introduce our next speaker, who will provide an update on the Scottish Government funding for international development. So please welcome Joanna Keating.
For somebody taller than me. I'm just glad it's you doing this. It would be terrible if the speaker's knocked out before she speaks. Thanks very much, everybody, and good morning. I'm Joanna Keating. I'm the Head of International Development in the Scottish Government, so clearly not a minister, not a contender to be FM. I am an official, and as such, a civil servant, impartial. But here in the place of our Minister, Neil Gray, Minister for International Development. He extends his apologies. He's not able to join us today, but he asked me to come and speak to you all today. He actually met with Andrew Mitchell yesterday, our keynote speaker from this morning. They discussed 0.7%, the importance of the UK's commitment on that, talked about climate justice, talked about Afghanistan women and girls, and they also talked about the direction of travel in terms of our own Scottish Government international development ambitions. I just mentioned there that the SDGs have definitely not been forgotten within the Scottish Government. It's not something that's gone away. I mean, we're very much still in that space of the dual commitment that our First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, made back in 2015 of domestically through our National Performance Framework, but also contributing internationally through our international development work. And our international development work, for those that don't know much about this, we have an 11.5 million international development fund, a £1 million per annum humanitarian emergence fund. My team manages those, and our colleagues in climate have the separate climate justice fund. So it's a good offer from the Scottish Government. I just want to make the point, probably for anybody not aware of this, it is additional funding to that of the UK Government. So actually in Scotland, we're actually giving that additional offer. Our funding does count as, our ODA counts as part of UKG ODA. It's taken into account by them, but just maybe to make that point for those that don't know. And Francis has already given out the shout, thanks very much, about the National Outcomes Review consultation, which just launched 2 days ago. So I really encourage people to, really to engage with that. So today I just want to talk a bit about opportunities, not just in terms of funding, but actually opportunities for Scotland in terms of policy development, in terms of how we as a nation can really make that role for Scotland, that role working with our partner countries, Malawi, Zambia, Rwanda and Pakistan. So just say a little bit here. I guess, our sort of strapline there we've got here is that smaller countries like Scotland, really can make that big difference when we're focusing on policy, different ways of doing things, listening to our partners. I'd also encourage you to read. I'm only going to do obviously a 20-minute talk this morning, but our Minister Neil Gray did a lecture just 2 weeks ago at Strathclyde University on that was on the title of our long-term vision for international development in the post-COVID era. It's on our website, so I'd really encourage you to read that. It was a 40-minute lecture that the Minister gave, and it really set out our direction of travel. So it's really stemming from our review that we did in light of COVID, looking at how we approach international development over the next sort of 5 to 10 years. Those of you who have engaged with the review know that we co-created a new set of principles. So what we're doing at the moment really is implementing the outcomes of our review and aligning with the principles that came out of that review. In terms of the review, in terms of the principles, we were listening to the voices of the Global South. We were very clear in doing that. And we looked at the great work we'd already achieved, but we were looking to learn lessons from our partners. And from this, we've developed the sectoral key areas that we're going to be funding in future. Our new funding will be starting, our new funding programme, in the next financial year, 2023 onwards. I should say that we remain committed to our partner countries, Malawi, Zambia, Rwanda and Pakistan. So really what I want to kind of say a little bit about today is probably around a sort of four-pronged approach here, which you'll see here, there we go, on starting just talking about, first of all, about development investment. So our aim really is that our funding, although it's modest, can create transformative impact in our partner countries. That's what we're aiming for with new, bigger programmes, and by taking an approach in 4 different ways. We're taking a feminist approach to our funding from now on. That's something we've committed to. We're aligning with our new principles. They've got commitment to partner country-led development, to equality, diversity, inclusion, to amplifying Global South voices, and through solidarity with our partners. We'll continue to work in partnership and seeking to equalise power with our Global South partners. That's about shifting power. And again, that language about shifting power, I'll come on to because we've had some interesting feedback on that language itself from our partners. And also just about for us selecting sectors where Scotland can actually provide added value beyond the financing that we give. So thinking about the expertise that lies in Scotland. So in terms of our new programming, I know people are interested in that in particular, and funding opportunities. We're developing new programmes on health, for example. We've got 3 new strands that are coming online from 23, a new focus in our main big health programme on NCDs. We're working with design specialists at the moment on that, and that's really looking at an area where Scotland has particular skills and expertise. And for us, it's been really interesting. I think the feedback from Global South partners so far has been that NCDs is an area that's not attracting a lot of funding, so there's real interest, excitement about the offer that the Scottish Government is going to make in this area. The second stream, we've already committed longer term and secure funding for one of our longest term partners. That's Kamuzu University of Health Sciences in Malawi. It used to be known as the College of Medicine. And that's really putting them into a special place, non-competitive funding. It's part of our equalising power agenda, part of our commitment. It will allow QHES, the university, to continue to develop initiatives such as the Blantyre NCDs Research Laboratory. We've already invested £1 million into that over the last 5 years to really put in place or support a world-class laboratory in Malawi. Also the establishment of Malawi's first dental school, we've supported that too through QHES. The third strand, we're setting up a new health partnerships programme that's going to support NHS global citizenship initiatives, those that will seek to improve health systems in our partner countries. Moving on to education, we're setting up a new inclusive education programme. Again, we're working currently with a team of design specialists, and that's with a particular interest in special needs education and girls' education. These have been sectors nominated by our partner countries. We're also working on a new equalities programme. We continue to fund Police Scotland, for example, who work in partnership with the police forces in Malawi and Zambia, originally on GBV and children's protection of children, now moving on to a wider grouping focused on protection of vulnerable adults. We're setting up a new Women and Girls Fund that will be established later this year. And this fund, it's really about taking that feminist approach in the way that we develop the fund as much as what the fund itself will be available for. It will be created for community organisations in our 3 partner countries, with women's rights groups invited to design the fund itself. That's taking that feminist approach. We've already published the prior information notice, the PIN, for that at the end of January for a partner to run and design the design and delivery of that new fund. And that's going to be direct funding of small organisations in our partner countries. That's again part of shifting power, part of inclusiveness. So I'll say a bit more about the timelines for these programmes shortly. I'll also say there'll be a copy of my slides that will be available from the Alliance, so don't worry about having to take too many notes or having to try and draw timelines. That's all on the slides. Other sectors, I talked a little bit about how Scotland, looking beyond the finance, actually about our expertise again. So just to make you aware maybe of some of the other areas that we're partnering in Malawi, Zambia and Rwanda. Last year we launched a new Global Renewable Centre at the UN Sustainable Energy for All conference in Kigali. That's sited at Strathclyde University, building on our partnership with them over many years in Malawi. And what they're looking at the moment in this first year is to find partners in Malawi, Zambia and Rwanda. That will then be a virtual centre, a website for sharing of information, expertise, etc. on renewable energy. So again, that's hooking into Scotland's vast experience and expertise on renewable energy. I should also mention my colleagues in Water Division. Francis talks about policy coherence. It's something that we've really worked to try and achieve in the Scottish Government over many years. So our colleagues in Water Division have worked in partnership with the water team in the Malawian Government for many years, conducting large-scale water mapping in Malawi and really sort of innovative on water resource management. We also maintain, as I've mentioned, a Climate Justice Fund. We know that's been announced. Obviously, there was the COP26 announcements and loss and damage as part, a really key part of that. Our Climate Justice Fund is additional to my own area's team, and it's trebling to 36 million over this parliamentary term. So I'll move on to kind of point 2 here about Scotland's role in providing ethical leadership on global issues. We believe that Scotland does have that ethical role. Frances has said herself we should aim high. Absolutely, we should have high ambitions for Scotland as part of an interconnected world. Those global issues on equality, non-discrimination, human dignity, rule of law, sustainable development, climate justice, fair trade, all underpinned by a human rights approach. We've already heard today, and that recognition that Scotland's leadership at COP26 was really clear. We were the first global North country to acknowledge its moral responsibility to address loss and damage as an issue of climate justice. As you know, our First Minister pledged a world first at that time, £2 million of government finance to support practical action in some of the world's most climate vulnerable communities. Our pledge was then joined by other governments, so again it's that leadership role that other countries are following behind what Scotland has done, and I think it's something really to be proud of, you know, for all of us here in Scotland. In fact, Malawi's President Chakwera recently said about the Scottish Government's Loss and Damage Fund, "This fight belongs to all of us, and I believe that this example will serve as a prototype of what could happen." So that's that real partnership between Scotland and Malawi, and that leadership jointly between our leaders. Just also worth noting today, the Scottish Government has today, with our partners IIED, launched the long-form report, Practical Action for Addressing Loss and Damage. You'll get that online, hot off the press. Again, on equalising power in international development relationships, part of this ethical leadership. And again, I was really interested in the discussion about the language. One of the things that we have done is set up an innovative Global South panel. So it's to advise our ministers, and that's coming forward from the work that we did during the review, where we were listening to the Global South and hearing what they were saying. So that Global South is now a standing panel. It's currently meeting monthly and advising us as we move forward with our programming and development of our work on education, health, etc. It's been described by UN Women in Malawi as a world first. We're proud of that, and we hope that other countries follow our lead on this. Mentioned just on language there, I think one of the interesting things for us has been a challenge to us about talking about shifting power. That's a challenge to us from our Global South panel. And we've shifted our language already on that to now talk about equalising power, thinking about, you know, the language of gender, not to talk about shifting power because power's there already. So that's been a good challenge to us that we've taken on board. We're also creating, and you know, again, just thinking about equalising power, we're also creating more and new direct funding opportunities for our partner countries for small organisations. So I've talked about the new Women and Girls Fund. We've also got a new Global Citizenship Fund, which will come on stream as well. And I've mentioned our now guaranteed funding for QHES, the university in Malawi, and its special place in our programme about allowing them to set their own priorities and tell us what they want investment in. Also, just to mention, we've been working within my team over the last year on gender equality mainstreaming. That's really about how we implement the OEC gender markers. And through that as well, we've been hosting over the last few months a series of meetings with the gender ministries from our partner countries, because what we want to do is align with what they're already doing, and some really absolutely fabulous and rich discussions that have come on gender equality through those meetings and discussions with the gender ministries. And that allows us to take that Global South perspective to really understand that we're fitting within our partner countries' existing systems. So moving on, point number 3, about Scotland as the bridge builder between the Global South and North. This was a concept that First Minister really talked a lot about at COP26, about advocacy, about listening and being able to stand in global solidarity with our partners in the Global South. On Tuesday, our own Minister hosted a meeting with the vaccine equity activists, and there was a really key point from one delegate that really struck home with me, where he said to us, "Speak out in solidarity, never on our behalf. Use your circles of influence." That's the advice to us, Scottish Government. I should also highlight that this year marked the 10th anniversary of Scotland as a fair trade nation. Again, only the second country that is a fair trade nation. A really nice celebration that there has been, ongoing celebrations on that. We've also talked today about the value and importance of supporting global citizenship in Scotland, and that's something that Francis had mentioned as well. We continue to support global citizenship in Scotland. We have funding for our 4 organisations, civil society networks, the Alliance itself. We continue to core fund the Scotland-Malawi Partnership, the Scottish Fair Trade Forum, and in Malawi, the Malawi-Scotland Partnership, the sister to SMP. And that's really about supporting all of you in Scotland. That there is that ability to network, to come together, events like these. We're supporting that within Scotland. I've also mentioned briefly that we're putting in place a new global solidarity strand, and that's for a new global citizenship fund. That will allow funding for smaller organisations, civil society organisations in Scotland, and again it will also allow for new direct funding opportunities for our organisations in our partner countries. We think that's probably around the areas of advocacy, etc., and capacity building, but it's something that we're discussing. We've been co-designing with the NGOs themselves. I think probably also there'll be interest here, I could hear obviously from the room, about climate justice and loss and damage. Again, that funding is being created at the moment. The commitment has been made in terms of the amounts. It's a gender responsive funding, which is focused on addressing non-economic and slow onset loss and damage. It's a co-owned approach. It's still in the early stages of development, that programme. I know people will be keen to hear about that today. On 23rd of February, so just a few weeks ago, our colleagues had organised a stakeholder consultation, and that was to discuss the mechanism for delivery and for gathering views. And at the end of this, as I've said, there's the Climate Justice Fund is there for the period to the end of this Parliament, that's 2026, and all funds will be dispersed by then. I've just given you there the slide that just sets out, and these are the new pillars in terms of our funding, what I've talked about today about health, but the areas there about education, inclusive education, equalities, Women and Girls Fund, Police Scotland, Comic Relief we've been partners with for many years, and actually some of the lessons that we learned from our partnership with Comic Relief on levelling the field, funding women and girls empowerment through the mechanism of sport has been a great learning lesson. Direct funding, and it was about co-development of that fund. So that's really just our timelines over the next year. As those of you who know the team, we are a very small team, massive ambitions, but we are a very small team. So we're continuing to manage our 11.5 million per annum budget. We're reacting to humanitarian crisis. I hope some of you will have seen that yesterday we'd announced a further £1 million for support of Pakistan floods. And that was through a further donation of £500,000 to the DEC appeal, but also an additional 500,000 which we run through the British
that you have already experienced working in different countries, and also considering the education need in Syria. Do you have a new plan to expand and adding an additional country maybe, or when this process can happen? And I understand, of course, the limitation in terms of funding, but also considering the needs. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks very much. So if I take us back to 2016, we ran a large-scale public consultation at that point on our geographic focus. At that time, we had a presence, or we had funding investment in 7 different countries, and what we were looking to do at that time was really recognising that it is a smaller amount of money. We need to be targeted, we need to be focused in order to have that transformative impact. That really got widespread support in terms of how we actually take this forward. It allows us to have much better relationships, real strong partnerships with our partner countries. So that's really where we are at the moment. I would say, I'm sure if my minister was here, he would say in the event of independence and a larger Scottish a budget for Scotland, clearly there would be a difference in programming and country spread. But in terms of our current constitutional settlement and the fact that this is additional money from the Scottish Government, we're really looking at how we really focus that budget carefully and really working on that. What I would say, of course, is that we also have, I'd mentioned our Humanitarian Emergency Fund, so that's £1 million per annum. We actually gave an additional £4 million last year for Ukraine. That was on top of our Humanitarian Emergency Fund. And we have funded, actually just recently, there's a standing panel of NGOs in Scotland, humanitarian NGOs in Scotland, who are on that standing panel, and they trigger that the Humanitarian Emergency Fund to trigger for crises around the world, and Syria, Turkey is what has been one of the more recent ones. So that's areas where we are contributing, and I've mentioned already that we've contributed for Pakistan quite heavily over the last year as well. So that gives that wider focus, and certainly in terms of just over the last year with the Humanitarian Emergency Fund, we've contributed to Burkina Faso for famine in East Africa. So it's really that gives the kind of wider geographic spread that I guess that you're interested in. Hope that helps.
We've got some questions coming into Slido. One person's asked, can you provide a little more context about what a feminist approach entails to the Scottish Government ID team?
Thanks very much. So it's really about, at its basic, it's a human rights approach. There was a commitment given by the Scottish Government in our programme for government in 2022, and that was about taking a feminist approach to all of our foreign policy work. Now, obviously, international development being a key part of that, and where we have that budget. So what we've been doing over the last year is the central team within the Scottish Government has been really working, and it's been a real consultative process about what actually is meant by a feminist approach, and our team has been really heavily involved in that in terms of what it means in particular in the international development context. So we're still working through that at the moment. We've had a number of working groups, working parties, consultation events over the last year, and that has allowed everybody, and we've run some specifically for international development sector as well, from which we got some really great feedback. In terms of our designing of our work at the moment, probably the easiest example I can give of its practical application is our New Women and Girls Fund. And what we're doing with that is we're basically putting this one out, that we're looking for an organisation to design and run this for us. It will be designed, we're not setting what the fund will be for. We will appoint the contractor to actually take forward the fund, and through discussions with women's groups, they will determine what the funding opportunities should be. So that's a kind of really key example there of how the rights-based approach to how the feminist principles mean that decisions are made locally by the women's groups in terms of what should actually be funded. And we're hoping through this it will be funding women's rights groups.
And can I take another question from the floor? Yeah, we have the gentleman in the 4th or 5th row with his hand up with a blazer. We could get a mic to him.
Okay, thank you very much for hearing us those opportunities. It's working, okay. My question, I know Scotland is a small country in Europe, and working, is a very amazing job, especially, the job you are doing, especially in Africa, those small, poor countries in Africa. I really appreciate about that. But the main problem of Africa is leadership, and the big problem is the leadership and the management issue. Is there any way, because there is a lot of expertise and knowledge in managing the country, managing the development, how to transfer those knowledge into Africa, especially those poor countries, or at union level. Africa Union itself is very weak in institutions which cannot lead the region itself. So is there any opportunity to expand your partnership working with Africa Union or those Africa's problem of leadership, serious leadership problem, political problem in Africa, so that each effort coming from outside is demolished in one night because of the problem of leadership. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I mean, I guess, in terms, again, referring to our current constitutional settlement, Scotland is a devolved nation within the UK, so there is a bit respecting in relation to that. I mean, what I would say in relation to both Malawi and Zambia over the last few years is, there's been some really amazing democratic movements that are happening. If you look at what happened with the Malawian elections, a couple of years ago, and the role of the courts in terms of overturning that and bringing forth new peaceful elections. So that's been something that, and they actually won, the award for that in recognition of the judges in relation to that, those decisions in relation to that process. So I think there's something there about, democracy delivering leaders. Zambia as well, we've seen, again, just within the last 18 months, another election there, again, very peaceful, democratic elections. So I think, there's democracy, and I think for the Scottish Government in terms of our commitment about speaking out about human rights, about speaking out about democracy and the rule of law, that's something that we take very seriously. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Joanna. Could we please give a round of applause for Joanna, who will be... Thank you very much. Take a seat. So I want to thank everybody who's taken the time, insights into global development and how, we, in some way, one action does affect each other, and I think working towards global solidarity, which is, obviously going back to the theme, is so important, and we really do need that global solidarity in this day and age. Please do follow up on the conversations you've heard today with the Alliance. The Members Hub is an online space where collaborations can take place, and the Alliance team are always keen to hear your ideas. I want to thank all our speakers and all the attendees who've come today, and thanks to our headline sponsors, StoneX, who we're incredibly grateful for their support. Thanks also to our exhibitors, the Centre for Sustainable Development, University of Strathclyde, Diversity Travel, the Scottish Government Humanitarian Emergency Fund, and WaterAid Scotland. Thank you so much, and please do go downstairs and enjoy some lunch. Thank you.